$7 million landed on the conference table like a verdict. The briefcase snapped open. Banded stacks of cash caught the cold afternoon light from the 42nd floor windows. Catherine Hale stood at the head of the table, 34 years old, a $3 billion empire at her back, and she fixed her gaze on the man across from her. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a financial advisor. He was wearing a security guard uniform, a radio still clipped to his belt, and he had walked in from the hallway 30 seconds ago. "Solve this," Catherine said, "and everything I own, including me, is yours." The room erupted in laughter. The man looked down at $7 million. Then he looked straight into her eyes. "I don't need your money." The laughter died. He hadn't flinched. What came next would prove that money was never the point. Daniel Mercer had a system. 6:15 in the morning. Badge in, coffee black. Radio check on all 3 floors he was responsible for. 6:40. First sweep of the executive corridor on 22, where the carpet was thicker and the silence had a different quality, the kind that came from people who had learned how to keep their voices down in expensive rooms. By 7, he was done. By 2:50 in the afternoon, he was in his car, pulling out of the parking structure on West 48th Street, heading toward a school in Midtown, where a 9-year-old named Lily stood on the front steps waiting for him with her backpack. Straps pulled too tight, the way she always wore them. That was the system. He had built it carefully, the way he used to build arguments, accounting for every variable, leaving no gaps. 3 years ago, he'd had a different system. A car service at 5:30, a desk on the 31st floor of a building 4 blocks north, a title that took 12 seconds to read off a business card. He'd been deputy general counsel at one of the largest investment banks on Wall Street, the kind of role where his phone rang on federal holidays and his signature appeared on documents that moved markets. He had been very good at it. He had also been, for long stretches, almost entirely absent from the life of the woman he married and the child they were raising together. Emily had never complained. That was the part that stayed with him. She got her diagnosis on a Tuesday. She was gone 14 months later. And Daniel stood in the kitchen of their apartment on a Wednesday morning, Lily eating cereal across from him, 6 years old and very quiet. And he understood with complete clarity that the architecture of his life needed to come down. Not because he was broken. He wasn't, not entirely. But because the only thing left that mattered was sitting across from him with milk on her chin. He took the security position at Hale Financial 8 months later. The hours fit. The work was straightforward. Nobody needed him to be impressive, which was a relief he hadn't anticipated. He was, by every visible measure, a man who had stepped all the way back. What nobody in that building knew, what he had no particular interest in advertising, was that he still read every SEC enforcement action that crossed the Federal Register. Still tracked case law the way other men tracked sports scores. The knowledge hadn't gone anywhere. He had simply stopped using it. Until a Monday morning in October, when a door on the 22nd floor was left 2 inches open. He heard the voices before he saw the light. 3 of them, maybe 4, the kind of controlled tension that meant someone in that room was trying very hard not to raise their voice. Daniel slowed his pace without meaning to. Class action is the least of it. EC subpoena landed Friday. The clawback clause is already triggered, which means he stopped. Not because he was curious. He stopped because those 3 phrases in that sequence assembled themselves in his mind into something precise and complete. A legal structure he recognized the way a surgeon recognizes a specific kind of damage. A clawback clause triggering simultaneously with an SEC subpoena didn't happen by accident. It meant someone inside the company had been specifically flagged by regulators, not caught in a broad sweep. And if the people in that room were treating the clawback provision as their primary exposure, they were looking at the wrong wall entirely. He stood in the hallway for 4 seconds. Then he pushed the door open. 15 people around a conference table. Lawyers, he assumed, from the quality of their suits and the way two of them immediately reached for their legal pads. Several executives he recognized from the floors above, and at the head of the table, Catherine Hale. He had seen her in passing before, in the elevator, twice, moving through the lobby with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned early that time wasted on pleasantries was time given away. 34 years old. The kind of composed that wasn't calm, but was something more deliberate than calm. She had taken over as CEO from her father 5 years ago, and had not, by any account Daniel had read, done a single thing to suggest the company had landed in the wrong hands. She was the only person in the room who didn't laugh. The others did. A short, reflexive sound. The laughter of people who process the unexpected by dismissing it. A security guard. In this room. Now. Catherine looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read, and then she reached down and opened the briefcase that sat beside her chair. She placed it on the table and turned it so the contents faced him. Banded stacks of cash, neat and dense, catching the light from the windows behind her. "Solve this," she said, "and everything I own, including me, is yours." The room laughed again, louder this time. Daniel looked at the money. He had seen larger sums move in a single morning, back when moving large sums was what he did. He looked up at Catherine Hale, who was still watching him with that unreadable expression. "I don't need your money." The laughter stopped. Catherine studied him for a moment. Then she stood, walked past the nearest attorney without a word, and gestured toward the hallway. He followed her out. The corridor was empty. The sound of the conference room, rustling papers, someone beginning a sentence, was swallowed by the closed door. Catherine stood with her arms at her sides, not leaning against anything, and looked at him directly. "You're the overnight security lead," she said. "You've been in this building for 2.5 years. 2 years. 4 months. She waited. Daniel kept his voice level. "Before I tell you what I think I heard, did your CFO make the timing decision himself? On the trade? Or did someone confirm the schedule for him?" Something shifted in her face. Not surprise, exactly. More like the particular alertness of someone who has just heard a question that reframes everything and knows it immediately. "None of my attorneys asked that," she said. "I know." The clawback clause, he explained, was a provision most people treated as a punitive measure. The SEC's way of recovering compensation after wrongdoing was established. But it could also be used as a pressure instrument, deployed early to signal seriousness, while the real investigative thread was being developed elsewhere. If someone had confirmed the trade timing for the CFO, if there was a third party involved in the decision, then the clawback provision wasn't the weapon, it was the distraction. The actual exposure was somewhere the attorneys hadn't looked yet. Catherine listened without interrupting. That itself told him something. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, not uncertain, but thinking, the way people think when they're rapidly reassessing. "You heard that from the hallway," she said. "The door was open." She looked at him carefully. "Who are you?" It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question, asked by someone who had spent a career learning how to ask the right ones. Daniel didn't answer it directly. There was no version of the answer that wouldn't sound like something she wasn't ready to believe yet. Instead, he held her gaze and waited. Catherine Hale made decisions quickly. He would come to understand that about her. She turned back toward the conference room, retrieved a thick folder from beside the briefcase, and returned to the hallway. She held it out. "Read everything," she said. "I'll be in the office until 9. He took the folder. Their fingers didn't quite touch. She went back inside. The door closed, and Daniel stood alone in the corridor on the 22nd floor, holding a file that was going to change the next several weeks of his life, already certain of 3 things. The CFO hadn't acted alone. Someone was working very hard to make sure no one found out. And the people in that room had no idea how little time they had left. The employee break room on the 14th floor had 2 vending machines, a table that wobbled on its left side, and no windows. Daniel spread the contents of the folder across the table at 7:40 in the evening and didn't look up for 3 hours. The file was dense. Regulatory correspondence, internal compliance reports, trading records, board minutes going back 18 months. On its surface, the case against James Whitfield was airtight. The CFO of Hale Financial's primary subsidiary had purchased 43,000 shares of that subsidiary's stock 5 days before a major acquisition was publicly announced. The SEC had the transaction records. They had the timing. They had the dollar amount, which came to just over $1.2 million in realized gains. What they were building toward was a straightforward insider trading charge, the kind that juries understood because the numbers were clean and the sequence was simple. Daniel read it all twice. Then he went back to the compliance archive, a secondary folder, flagged as supplementary, the kind of material junior associates attach to files without reading, and he found something that didn't fit. It was a fragment, an incomplete deletion in a backup server log, the kind of technical residue that happened when someone wiped a mailbox from the front end without accounting for the recovery partition. 3 emails, partially reconstructed. The sender address was routed through an internal relay, the kind of configuration that was supposed to anonymize the origin point, but if you knew what the metadata structure looked like on Hale Financial's legacy server system, told you exactly which machine the message had originated from. The machine belonged to Victor Hale. Daniel sat back and looked at the ceiling of the break room for a long moment. Victor Hale was Catherine's older brother. He sat on the board of directors. He had, by all public accounts, accepted the transfer of operational control to his sister without resistance when their father stepped down. The board minutes told a different story, a series of procedural challenges, motions that had failed narrowly, a pattern of opposition that had been consistent and methodical and almost entirely invisible unless you were reading for it. Whitfield hadn't made a decision. He had followed an instruction. The trade, the timing, the exposure, all of it had been handed to him by someone who understood exactly what the SEC would find and had calculated that what they found would be enough to destabilize Catherine's leadership without ever pointing back to the person who had arranged it. Daniel closed the folder at 10:50 at night. He had a voicemail from Lily's after-school coordinator and a missed call from a number he didn't recognize. He called Catherine first. She answered on the second ring. "Your CFO is a fall guy," Daniel said, "and I know who set him up." The emergency board meeting Victor Hale convened 2 days later was by any structural measure a well-executed move. He didn't come in loud. He came in prepared. Seated at the center of the long table in the 32nd floor boardroom, he laid out his argument with the patience of someone who had been composing it for longer than the crisis had existed. Catherine, he said, had made a decision that no serious executive could defend. She had handed the most consequential legal crisis in the company's history to an unlicensed, uncredentialed security guard. A man with no standing before the SEC, no bar membership, no professional liability. A man whose involvement, if it became public, would give plaintiffs' attorneys and regulatory investigators every reason to question the competence of the entire leadership structure. 3 of the 5 board members were listening in a way that meant they were not yet decided. Catherine sat at the opposite end of the table and did not interrupt him. She let him finish. Then she picked up her phone, stood, and walked out of the room. She made one call from the hallway outside. Patricia Cole was one of the most respected securities litigators in New York, a former federal prosecutor who had spent 20 years building a practice that companies called when they needed the kind of help that couldn't be improvised. Catherine had worked with her once before, 4 years ago, on a matter that had taken 11 months to resolve and had cost the company more than the original exposure. She trusted her completely. Cole's assistant answered. Catherine asked to be put through directly. When Cole came on the line, Catherine didn't lead with the crisis. She led with the document. "I have a legal analysis," she said, "that I need you to read before you decide whether to take this on. It was prepared by someone without a law license. If you read it and tell me it's worthless, I will never call this number again." Cole said she would give it 1 hour. The file was sent electronically. 40 minutes later, Catherine's phone rang. Patricia Cole did not say it was impressive. She didn't offer any adjective at all. What she said was, "Who prepared this?" And the way she asked it, not skeptically, but with the careful neutrality of someone controlling a reaction, told Catherine everything she needed to know. She went back into the boardroom. Victor was still talking. "The analysis has been reviewed by Patricia Cole," Catherine said, cutting across him. "She's agreed to lead our external representation. The board can contact her office directly if they'd like her assessment of the document's quality." The room shifted. Cole's name did what names, like Cole's name did, in rooms like this one. Victor looked at his sister across the length of the table. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. The vote on the no-confidence motion was tabled for 48 hours. Daniel was crossing the parking structure on the building's second sublevel on a Thursday evening when he heard footsteps that were too deliberate to be accidental. Victor Hale was not a man who appeared in parking garages by coincidence. He was dressed in a coat that cost more than Daniel's monthly salary, and he walked with the unhurried confidence of someone who had arranged for there to be no witnesses. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "I hope you have a moment." He spoke for approximately 6 minutes. He had done his research. Daniel gathered that quickly, from the specificity of what Victor knew and the order in which he presented it. The years at the investment bank, the cases Daniel had worked on, the kind of institutional knowledge that didn't show up in public records, but was available to someone who knew which former colleagues to call. Victor framed it as admiration, which was the correct frame. He was not wrong that Daniel was capable of more than his current position reflected. The offer was concrete, a senior role in a new entity Victor was in the process of structuring, contingent on a transition of leadership at Hale Financial that Victor described as inevitable. 3 times Daniel's current salary, stability. The kind of position that a single father with a 9-year-old in a city like New York had very rational reasons to take seriously. Daniel listened to all of it. He didn't move his weight from one foot to the other. He didn't look away. When Victor finished, Daniel looked at him for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked to his car. He had his phone out before he reached the door. Catherine answered quickly. "Daniel, Victor just approached me in the parking structure," he said. "Full offer. Senior position, 3 times salary, contingent on his takeover completing. A beat on the line. He knows who you are. He knows enough." Daniel unlocked the car and got in, but didn't start it. He wouldn't have made that offer if he thought he was winning. That's what I want you to understand. He did this because he's running out of moves. Or because he thinks you're a variable he can neutralize. Same thing, Daniel said. Either way, he's scared. Scared people make the offer before they know whether they need to. Catherine was quiet for a moment, not uncertain, thinking. He had come to recognize the difference. "The SEC hearing is Tuesday," she said. "I know. We need to go through the full structure this weekend. All of it." The offices of the Securities and Exchange Commission's New York Regional Division occupied the 19th floor of a building in Lower Manhattan, and they were exactly as institutional as the name suggested. Fluorescent lighting, gray carpet, the specific stillness of a place where people came to answer difficult questions under oath. Daniel was not permitted inside. He had known this would be the case. He had no legal standing in that room, no credentials, no formal role. Nothing that entitled him to sit at the table where Catherine and Patricia Cole faced the commission's examination team. What he had was a tablet and a seat on a wooden bench in the hallway outside, and the same number he had been texting Catherine from for the past 11 days. Cole had gone over the strategy with him twice, in 2 separate calls, in the way that experienced attorneys occasionally consulted people they would never officially acknowledge consulting. She had not commented on his background. She had asked questions, listened to his answers, and then said, "All right," in a tone that meant she had decided to trust the analysis. The hearing began at 11:12 in the morning. Daniel's first message went through at 11:14. Page 41. The examiner's going to anchor on the trade date. Don't let them establish it as the reference point. Whitfield's calendar entry from the prior week is the counter. 3 minutes passed. Then, Cole used it. They're moving to the communication records. He had marked every page of the file with a corresponding counter-argument. Not for Catherine, but with Catherine, over the course of 2 evenings at the table in his kitchen, while Lily did homework on the couch and occasionally came over to look at the papers with the serious expression of a child who understood that something important was happening without knowing what. He had walked Catherine through the logic of each sequence, what the examiners would reach for, why it would seem decisive, and where the actual weight of the evidence fell when you examined the metadata rather than the surface record. The messages came in clusters, sometimes 5 minutes apart. Once, a gap of 23 minutes that told him they had moved into a more complex exchange, the kind that didn't allow for even a glance at a phone. He waited. The hallway was very quiet. At 2:13, the message he sent went unanswered for 11 minutes. He had written, "If they raise the board communication, do not reference the server routing directly. Let Cole introduce it. She needs to be the one holding that document when it lands." Then, at 2:24, she introduced it. The examiner just asked for a recess. Daniel set the tablet down on the bench beside him. Around him, the building continued its ordinary business. People in suits, moving between offices, an elevator opening and closing, the distant sound of a printer. He was, by every external measure, simply a man sitting in a hallway with no particular role in anything. At 2:24, the door at the end of the corridor opened. Catherine walked out first. Cole followed, already looking at something on her phone. Catherine saw Daniel on the bench and came toward him. Her face gave away very little. It almost always gave away very little. But there was something in the set of her shoulders that was different from when she had gone in. She sat down next to him on the bench, not across from him. Next to him, close enough that their arms nearly touched, and she said nothing for a long moment. Then she held up her phone so he could see the screen. One word in the message thread they had been running all morning. Done. Daniel looked at it. He looked at the institutional gray of the hallway around them, the fluorescent light overhead, the ordinary, unremarkable texture of where they were sitting. No title, no acknowledgement, no record anywhere in that building that he had been involved in anything at all. He stayed where he was. So did she. Neither of them said anything, because there was nothing that needed to be said yet, and because both of them understood, without discussing it, that the night was not over. Victor Hale was across the city in a conference room with 3 board members and enough time left to call a vote before morning. The SEC hearing was finished. The harder thing was still ahead. They didn't talk about what came next, not there in the hallway. Catherine stood, buttoned her coat, and told him Cole would handle the debrief. Then she walked toward the elevator with the measured stride of someone who had trained herself not to let relief show in public. Daniel took the subway back to Midtown. He picked Lily up from the neighbor's apartment 2 floors down, listened to 20 minutes of detail about a disagreement at lunch that had apparently involved a disputed drawing of a horse, made pasta because it was what they had, and sat across from his daughter at the kitchen table thinking about server metadata, while she told him the horse had actually been very good. He put her to bed at 8:45, By 9, he was back at the kitchen table with his laptop and the secondary file he had not yet fully processed, the compliance document revision history that the legal team had flagged as administrative and set aside. It was not administrative. What Daniel had recognized earlier, and now confirmed across the next 4 hours, was a pattern of retroactive modification. Internal compliance documents, the kind that established what executives had been informed of and when, had been quietly revised in the weeks following the trade. The revisions were small, the sort of edits that looked like routine clarification. But the metadata embedded in each document told a different story. The modification timestamps clustered in a 72-hour window that began the day after the SEC issued its first inquiry letter. Someone had been editing the paper trail after the investigation had already started. The server routing from the deleted emails pointed to Victor's machine. The compliance document revisions originated from an account with board-level access credentials that had not been assigned to any executive currently named in the investigation. Cross-referenced with the board access log from the same 72-hour window, only one account had been active during all of the modification timestamps. The same account. Every time. Daniel finished the final cross-reference at 2:17 in the morning. He assembled everything into a single structured file: the reconstructed emails, the metadata chain, the revision history with timestamps, the access log correlation, and wrote a 4-page summary that moved through the evidence in the sequence a board member with no legal background could follow without losing the thread. He sent it to Catherine at 5:58. 12 minutes later, she forwarded it to every member of the board of directors with a single line of accompanying text. Before today's vote, please read what is attached. Daniel was on his morning sweep of the 22nd floor at 8:40 when his phone vibrated. Catherine. He stepped into the stairwell to take it. 2 of the 3 have already called me, she said. Her voice was level in the way that meant she was containing something larger than what was audible. The 3rd sent an email. They want to postpone the vote indefinitely pending a full review. Daniel leaned against the stairwell wall. Below him, the building hummed with its ordinary morning activity. Victor's going to know it came from you, he said. Yes. He'll move quickly. He'll try to characterize the document as fabricated. Cole is filing a formal preservation notice with the backup server administrator this morning, Catherine said. The original data gets locked before he can touch it. She anticipated that. Daniel nodded, more to himself than to her. Cole had been, throughout all of this, exactly what her reputation suggested. The vote? He asked. It's not happening today. A beat. Possibly not at all. He didn't say anything immediately. Through the stairwell door, he could hear the muffled sound of the elevator arriving on 22, someone's heels on the corridor floor. Go back to work, Catherine said. I'll call you when it's done. Victor Hale submitted his resignation from the board of directors 48 hours later. The statement released through his attorney cited personal reasons and a desire to pursue other opportunities. It was 3 sentences long and answered nothing. Within the week, James Whitfield met with the SEC's enforcement team, accompanied by his own attorney, and a willingness to provide a full account of the instructions he had received, the channel through which he had received them, and the name of the person who had told him the trade was cleared. The cooperation agreement he reached in exchange reduced his personal exposure significantly. The exposure it created for someone else was, by contrast, substantial. The SEC closed its formal inquiry into Hale Financial's corporate conduct 38 days after the hearing. The Commission's letter to the company's legal counsel noted that the materials provided during the examination had been thorough, and the cooperation of the company's representatives had been complete. Patricia Cole framed the letter and sent a copy to Catherine's office without comment. Catherine did not celebrate. She went back to work, the way she always did, because the company had lost 6 weeks of operational focus, and she was constitutionally incapable of treating a problem as resolved before the downstream consequences had been addressed. She restructured the compliance review process. She commissioned an independent audit of board-level access credentials. She promoted 2 people who had handled the uncertainty with exceptional steadiness and had one very direct conversation with a 3rd who had not. The crisis was over. The company moved forward. And on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the SEC letter arrived, Daniel was running his 640 sweep of the 22nd floor when the elevator opened and Catherine Hale stepped out. No suit jacket. No assistant. A coffee in each hand. He watched her walk the length of the corridor toward him with the same focused efficiency he had observed from the beginning, except that something in it was different this morning. The purpose was less institutional, the destination clearly him. She held out one of the cups. He took it. They stood at the window at the end of the corridor, the one that looked northwest over the geometry of Midtown, the buildings catching the early light in the particular way they did in October, when the angle was low and everything cast a long shadow. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The coffee was black. He noticed she had gotten his right. "What does your daughter like to eat?" Catherine asked. Daniel looked at her. Outside, a water tower on a building 2 blocks north caught the sun and held it. "Pasta," he said, specifically the kind with butter and no sauce, which she insists is not lazy. The corner of Catherine's mouth moved. "Let me make dinner," she said, "for both of you, if you want that." It was not a negotiation. It was not a transaction. It was the first thing she had said to him in nearly 2 months that had nothing to do with the company, the case, the evidence, the board, or any of the mechanisms by which the 2 of them had come to know each other. It landed differently because of that, with a kind of directness that was, he was beginning to understand, simply how she operated when she wasn't performing the role of CEO. He looked at her for a moment. "Friday," he said. She nodded once, the same decisive nod he had watched her use to close meetings, and turned back toward the elevator. 6 months passed in the way that time passes when the structure of a life is quietly changing, incrementally, without announcement, until one morning you look at the shape of things and understand that you are not where you were. In March, Catherine offered Daniel the position of general counsel at Hale Financial. She did it in her office, directly, without preamble, the same way she did everything. She told him what the role entailed, what the compensation was, and that she expected him to take 2 days to consider it before giving her an answer, because she had learned that he made better decisions when he resisted his first instinct to respond immediately. He took the 2 days. Then he said yes. The morning of his first day in the new role, Lily stood in the doorway of his bedroom while he put on the suit, the new one, charcoal gray, that he had not worn yet. She studied it with the seriousness she brought to most important matters, walked over without being asked, and reached up to straighten the collar. She stepped back, looked at him, nodded. "Good," she said, which was high praise from Lily, and went to find her backpack. The Friday dinners had become, without anyone formally deciding they would, a standing arrangement. Catherine came on Fridays. She was a better cook than either of them had anticipated, which Lily announced after the second dinner with the candor that 9-year-olds applied to all evaluations. Catherine had taken the assessment with the same composed expression she used in board meetings, which Lily apparently found satisfying, because she had nodded as if the matter were settled. What the dinners were, in terms of what was developing between Catherine and Daniel, neither of them had named directly. There was the professional reality. He worked for her now, which they had discussed once, briefly, and with enough pragmatism to put it in the category of things acknowledged and set aside. There was the personal reality, which was more complex and moved at its own pace and did not particularly require naming in order to be present. Lily had her own assessment of the situation, developed over several weeks of observation, and withheld, until the moment she chose to deploy it. It was a Friday in April. The three of them were at the kitchen table, the same table where Daniel had spread SEC files and metadata logs and compliance records through the fall, which now held plates of pasta and a glass of wine for each of the adults, and a glass of apple juice for Lily. Outside the window, the city was doing what the city did in April, which was to not quite decide whether it was still winter. Lily set her fork down. She looked at Catherine with the focused attention she usually reserved for things she was about to say something definitive about. "Are you staying?" she asked. The question was simple in its construction, and not simple in anything else. It was not asking about the evening. Both adults understood that. And Lily, who was 9, but had spent 3 years watching her father navigate a world she was perceptive enough to read correctly, understood it too. Catherine looked at Daniel. He was looking back at her with an expression she had not seen on him before. Open, in the way that people were open when they had stopped deciding how much to reveal. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. What his expression said was that the answer was hers, and he would receive whatever it was without conditions. Catherine looked at Lily. The girl was watching her with complete patience, her hands folded on the table with a gravity that was almost ceremonial. She had her father's quality of stillness, that capacity to wait for something without performing the waiting. Catherine's face did something it very rarely did in rooms where other people could see it. The composure she maintained as a professional reflex, the controlled surface she had spent years learning to hold steady, it moved. Not dramatically. Not in a way that anyone who didn't know her would have identified as significant. But it moved, and Daniel saw it. And Lily, who noticed everything, saw it too. "Do you want me to?" Catherine asked. The question came back gently, not as deflection, but as the thing Catherine Hale did when something mattered enough that she wanted to be certain she was reading it correctly. Lily picked up her fork. "Yes," she said, "obviously." She said it the way she said most conclusive things, matter-of-factly, as if the answer had been apparent for some time, and the question had simply taken a while to catch up. Then she returned to her pasta with the focused attention of someone who had said what needed to be said and saw no reason to elaborate. Catherine looked at her plate. A small thing happened at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but close, and more unguarded than the version of herself she showed the rest of the world. Daniel reached across the table and touched the back of her hand, briefly, the way you touched something you were certain of. The $7 million had been a test. Catherine had designed it as one, a provocation, an impossible bar, the kind of challenge she threw at a room full of people to see what bounced back. What she had not designed for and could not have anticipated was a man who looked at $7 million and saw something that wasn't worth his time. Not because he didn't need money. He did, the way everyone did. But because he had already done the calculation, years ago, in a kitchen on a Wednesday morning with a 6-year-old across from him, and arrived at a number that money couldn't represent. What he needed was already in his life. What he had been waiting for, without knowing he was waiting, was something harder to quantify. The money had started the story, the briefcase, the challenge, the room full of laughter, and one woman who didn't join it. A door left 2 inches open on a Monday morning, a question no one else had thought to ask. A folder taken from one set of hands and carried down a hallway into 3 months of work that changed the shape of a company, a career, and a kitchen table on Friday evenings. None of it had a price. That was the point. That had always been the point. $7 million on a conference table, and the most valuable thing in the room had walked in from the hallway in a security uniform and hadn't flinched. What stayed, what was sitting at that table on a Friday night in April, the city outside the window and the 3 of them inside, had never been for sale.